everyone, and welcome to Arts and Crafts with a Naturalist. My name's Clarissa, and today we're going to be learning about the intertidal zone. So what I have here is my homemade intertidal zone. As the water recedes, you start to see life. It goes down and the tide is out. When the tide comes back in, we don't see anything anymore. And that is called the intertidal zone because that tide is going in and the tide goes out. And we see a bunch of waves. So what you'll need today is a white sheet of paper, a blue sheet of paper, some crayons or colored pencils. I've got crayons today, and a glue stick for the very end. So welcome. I hope you're ready to learn about the intertidal zone because it's definitely one of the more fascinating parts about the ocean to me, because these different animals, they live part of their life in the ocean and part of their life outside of the ocean. And that's very unique. We can't really survive too long underwater. There's scuba diving, but you need a tank of oxygen with you and that will eventually run out. Where these creatures in the intertidal zone have to have adaptations that allows them to retain water because that's how they get their oxygen. Some have even evolved the ability to get oxygen from the air, but most of them need oxygen from the water. So they have to be able to retain that water until the tide comes back in. So to get started, we can draw our intertidal zone. Let's get a gray crayon and we can draw some rocks. You can see large boulders on the beaches. These large rocks are great habitat for a variety of organisms that live in our intertidal zones. You can also find some smaller rocks up here in our intertidal zone. This will be our high intertidal zone, where the water doesn't really reach, only splashes. That's called the splash zone. Very creative with our naming there. And some sand you can find up here in the upper intertidal zone. Some cool creatures that you can find in the upper intertidal. We've got find the page. We've got barnacles. If you've ever seen rocks with a bunch of little white pokiness on them, those will be our barnacles. So barnacles can live pretty high up in the intertidal zone because they've got those shells that help protect them from losing a lot of water. That's a very light color. Drawing some barnacles on my rocks. We have a few different kinds of barnacles. Got giant acorn barnacles. They'll live deep down because they're massive. So they have a lot of water in them. They can't live that high on land because they need to replenish that water. But up high, you'll mostly find acorn barnacles or our little brown barnacles. Those are pretty small. You gotta look closely at the rock underneath all the acorn barnacles to find those guys. Another cool thing about barnacles is that it's their head that cements onto the rock. When they're little larvae, little plankton floating around in the water column, they'll settle onto the rock, and that's their head that settles and attaches. And so if you've ever seen a barnacle underwater, it has a little rake that comes out, and that's its foot. It uses its foot to scoop the water for plankton. So while it was once plankton, it then becomes a barnacle and then eats plankton. Crazy life cycle. So barnacles, high up in the intertidal, they've got those shells that they can shut, and then not a lot of water escapes, so they stay hydrated inside until the next tide comes. Another cool creature we have are snails and limpets. Let's see if I can find a good photo. Here are some limpets. There we go. There are some snails, periwinkles, dogwinkles, or dog whelks. Snails and limpets. So the snails that you find in Intertidal are pretty much like the ones that you find on land, but you don't find limpets on land. We can draw a bunch of limpets. They've got that cone-shaped shell. So unlike a snail, which shell spirals, these guys have more of a cone that comes down over them. And they can suction really hard to rocks, and then that allows them to stay moist, and they don't dry out when the tide goes out. There's my limpet on the rock. It's also pretty neat about these limpets is that they have a home. So usually you'll find them on a rock, and they've kind of got like an indent. They're in an indent in the rock that they made themselves. They go back to that same place every day. They go out foraging and then come back to their home in that tiny indent. So while you may not think that some of these creatures have homes, they do have homes to go back to. Snails, pretty cool. They've got a tongue with teeth. So does a lot of these creatures. The limpets as well has a tongue with teeth. So while our teeth and our tongue are separate, theirs are combined. So they can lick the rock for algae. Or our giant snail, we'll talk about later, the moon snail, drills holes in clams. So like I said, these things like to eat algae. So let's draw some algae on our rocks. Usually up in the higher tide, you'll find green algae. So there'll be a lot of that ulva, that green algae on the rocks. And that's their favorite food to snack on. There are so many creatures that live in the intertidal zone, but I'll probably only stick to a few. or else this video would be very long. And while I would love to talk about all the creatures, you might not love to listen about all of them. Another algae that you'll find up in the top is some red algae. It'll be like an encrusting. It kind of looks like coral, but it's actually a red algae called our coralline algae. Coralline algae has many forms. Some of it is branching, some of it is encrusting. I think that's good for upper intertidal. Now we're going to go a bit lower, stuff that needs a lot more water to survive. So if you've ever lifted up rocks and you see a bunch of crabs scuttling around, those are our shore crabs. They live on the shore. They're a crab, shore crabs. We've got many different kinds. We've got green shore crabs. We have red or purple shore crabs. Mine are looking very red. So if you see a lot of crab molts up on the beaches, that crab can be alive, or it can be, or it's just the molt, it's not alive. But if you find a molt and you open it up and there's not much inside, it's just the molt of the crab. The crab grew bigger, it sucked in more water, popped out the back of its shell, and scuttled away, having to regrow an entirely new shell. Whereas if you find a crab and you pop it open and it's gooey inside and mushy and it smells awful, that's a dead crab. So a lot of the shells that you'll see on the beach are just the molts of crabs and not dead crabs, especially during the spring and summer when they're really growing. Something that likes to eat these crabs, that lives on land but feeds into intertidal, are gulls or great blue herons. And I think I want to draw a great blue heron on mine. Great blue heron. Oh, my crayon broke. Sad. Great blue herons are those massive birds that you'll see along the beach. They'll stalk the water, and they've got really cool long legs that let them walk around without being seen, so that they can stalk. And look for prey. Great blue heron. So now let's get deeper down into the intertidal. Some more rocks. Some more smaller rocks. Put some sand. And now is where you find really cool stuff. So if you were with us the past weekend and a couple weekends ago at Meet the Beach, where we went to Priest Point and Barefoot Park, Sadly, we didn't make it to Ptolemy, only Bertha and Priest Point, but we had some really good intertidal zones there, and we saw some neat things out in the water, like sea stars down deeper in their intertidal zone, where they will be less exposed throughout time. We find our sea stars. So because they've got like gills on the outside, they need to absorb water through their skin. They can't stay out of water very long, or else they don't get enough oxygen. So you only find them during really low tides, like we had this past July for Meet the Beach. So these sea stars live in a bit lower. We've got our ochre sea stars, also known as purple sea stars, because they are orange and purple. Sometimes they can be pink. We've also got a few other species that you'll see around, like the mottled sea star, where you've got a leather star. Here's some really cool. So we've got the purple, also known as the ochre, for that purple and orange leather stars. Not really seeing these giant sunflower ones as much anymore. They are large. Mostly just small purple, orange, or the small mottled. Just trying to find a good color for that. There we go, sea stars. You also find some pretty large crabs like the red rock crab or the dungeon nest crab. Since they are a lot bigger, they're not going to be able to survive outside of water long, so you'll find them lower down in the intertidal. If you've ever seen a crab walk, they walk sideways. And that's because if they walked forward, they'd trip over all those legs. So they have to walk sideways to run away. At Meet the Beach, we found a red rock crab. And we could tell it's red rock because it had black tips on its fingers. And Meet the Beach is an event that the Puget Sound Estuarium puts on, where we have beach naturalists stationed at our parks. And you can come down to the beaches with your family, your friends, and ask us about anything you see along the beaches. And if you don't see anything, we'll find things for you. That's one of our favorite things. We love digging up moon snails and turning over rocks to find sea stars or fish. So in the intertidal zone, you can also find some gunnels. So it looks like an eel, but it's not. It's a fish. Gunnels will be thin and long like an eel, but they've got pectoral fins. So because they've got that pectoral fin, that means they're a fish and not an eel. So if you've ever heard of a wolf eel, they've got fins, they've got pectoral fins. So the wolf eel is actually a fish. Another cool fish that you can find would be our sculpins. So sculpins have massive heads and then it tapers into a small body. They love hiding in among these rocks. Big head tapers down to a small body. Give them that pectoral fin because they're a fish. Sculpin. And as I mentioned earlier, that moon snail. So we can draw how many colors? Our moon snail show. So these guys love to eat clams. They've got a massive foot. They'll drill a hole into a clam with that tongue with teeth, the radula. You'll also find algae down here too. More of the brown, if you've seen the big leafy brown, it's actually called a blade of seaweed, not a leaf. We are big leafy seaweeds down here. Because they can only withstand so much of drying out. Whereas ulva can dry out for quite a few hours, and then when the tide comes back in, it just sucks that water back and it's fine. You also find some cool purple, or not purple, red, but it looks purple, algae called iridescent algae, and that one's cool because it's got that iridescent or shiny look to it. Throw that in there. I think it's in the book. Iridescent, it's like a rainbow. Our ulva, the one leaf, or one sulfic. Our big bull kelp, that's a brown, it's got those. I think that's good. Look, our intertidal zone, it's looking full. And now, deep down. Stuff that you may see in the intertidal, but they like to live mostly deeper down. So those will be larger fish. We've got a midshipman, which is a pretty large fish. Bigger than our tide pool sculpins, bigger than our gunnels, which are pretty thin. They'll come into the intertidal zone to lay eggs, but mostly they'll be deeper in the water. They've also got those massive heads. And they've got really cool fins. Midshipman. Another really cool creature you might find in the intertidal. Be an octopus. Octopus can come up into the intertidal zones, but most of the time they'll be deep down. We've got two species here. You've got the giant Pacific octopus, largest octopus right here. Pretty neat. Also got, I think it's the red or common octopus that we've also got here. Not as big and exciting, but still an octopus is pretty cool. Might have to have a video where we talk about octopuses. So there we go. We've got our intertidal zone. Up here, the high intertidal. So this one will get the least amount of water. It'll be exposed a lot of the time. Here in the middle, it's basically even about the time that it's exposed versus not. And then the very low is rarely ever exposed, only during really low tides. So now time to make our tide so that it can go out and you don't see anything. And then it can creep in and exposes our intertidal life, but doesn't really expose the really deep stuff. So to make that, take your blue sheet of paper, fold it up, fold it down. So we're gonna make like an accordion fold. And conveniently, I think it looks like waves, which is what you get. But waves and tides are separate. So we get 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day. So if you go to the beach and the water is very high up on the beach, that'll be our high tide. And if you come back later, about 6 hours later, it'll be far out, and that will be our low tide. And if you go one day and it's really low, to find that low tide the next day, you come back 45 minutes later the following day. So if you go to the beach at 1 o'clock one day and the tide's really low and you want to go explore tomorrow, come back at 1:40, and that's when the low tide will be. Crazy how tides work. Very complicated. Not going to go too much into it. But then I'm going to put some glue on the bottom of our sheet. Glue our water. And now you can have the tide come in, covers everything. And then as the tide goes out, you see the intertidal life. So at some point, you may only see the small things on rocks that can really withstand a lot of desiccation, losing a lot of water. Things that are lower down, they don't really do well with losing a lot of water, so they typically stay closer down. And then the really deep stuff can come out to the intertide, but mostly will stay deep where there's lots of water and oxygen for them. So I hope you enjoyed making an intertidal display, the intertidal life. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those into the comments. We'll be monitoring this video to answer those. But if there's anything interesting you see at the beaches that has nothing to do with this video, then you can put that on our new Facebook page called Ask the Estuarium. So that is a page where you can ask us any question, and a staff member, volunteer, whoever has your answer for you will respond to that. Also, we are open. The Puget Sound Estuarium is open on the weekends from 10 till 4. Please come by and visit us, but make sure you're wearing your mask. That way we can keep you safe and you can keep our staff safe. Please make sure to follow us on Facebook so that you can get updates when we have these videos or events posted. Follow us on YouTube so that we can change our name on YouTube to Puget Sound Estuarium. You don't have to get notifications, just hit that follow button on YouTube and you'll do us a big favor. I think, oh, one more thing. 2 more things that I'm forgetting to mention. Another cool video put on by volunteers is Tiny Tides. So that's where we'll read a story, mostly having to do with the ocean or the estuary, and those are Fridays at 12. Give those a listen, share them with your friends if they have kids. We also have exciting live feedings on Saturdays at 3 p.m. So we will be feeding things in our tanks like our sea stars, our shrimp, our fish, and those guys can actually be pretty active. And so give those a watch. Those will be Saturdays at 3. And I hope you look forward to our next Arts and Crafts with a Naturalist. That will be next Monday at 3. Thank you.